In this video, we'll be focusing on Chapter 16, Section 3, Monetary Policy Tools. So we'll be looking at a number of tools that can help influence the economy to monetize it and to keep it stabilized. So, money creation. Money creation is the amount of money that is going into the economy, circulating through. It is the job of the Federal Reserve to monitor this to make sure that enough money supply is available. And one way they can do that is by putting a required reserve ratio on banks. And what that means is that banks are required to hold on to a certain percentage of money that is being put into their banks. We have something called the money multiplier effect as well. So whenever the government pours money into the economy, let's say they print $1 trillion and they put that into the economy, it's not just going to have a $1 trillion return. It's going to have a multi-trillion dollar return, just because the individuals who are receiving the money, the companies that are receiving the money, the corporations, that will have a multiplier effect because it's going to create expansion. It's going to create more work opportunities. It's going to create more consumers to buy more houses and cars. And so it has this multiplier effect behind it. And here is the formula for it, which we'll look at here soon as well. But it's a simple formula that's used. And then we have something called an excess reserve. An excess reserve is where the bank is holding on more to what is required. So let's say that the requirement was 5% and the bank has 7%. This is known as excess reserves. Now, let's talk about how can this tool be used to help stabilize the economy. So what we're going to do is let's do an example here. Let's say right now that 10% is the RRR. That is the percentage they're required to have. And let's say the economy is moving towards inflation. Well, what the Federal Reserve can do is increase the amount of the required reserve ratio. So going to increase this, which then will have the money supply go down. How does that work? So now instead of 10%, now the banks have to get an additional 5%, which means now they're going to have less money in the bank, which also means now they won't be able to lend as much money out, which results there's not enough money for everyone to get loans. On the other flip side of this is, let's say that we have the rate drop to 8%. It's going to lower the required reserve ratio. And my camera's not going to move here, so I'm just going to talk it through. And that's going to increase the money supply. How? Well, now there's an additional 2% that the banks can now use to give out loans, which result in more people being able to get more loans, which is going to have a multiplier effect. So that is one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is known as a prime rate. Remember we looked in Section 2 when we talked about the discount rate and the Federal Reserve rates that banks will lend to each other, or the Federal Reserve will lend to a bank? Well, they are given a prime rate. And if they want to increase the amount of money supply into the economy, these prime rates can be lowered, which means now that the money that's being lent back and forth by banks and by the Federal Reserve, there's more money now available, or it's going to be cheaper to borrow money. Whenever interest rates drop, you're going to have an impact. People will be more likely to go buy. So let's say right now you're going to go buy a car, you need $10,000, and the going interest rate is 1.5%. You'd be excited about that because it's extremely low. But what if they give you a rate of 18%? Well, you're going to think twice about borrowing that money. And that's the same thing that happens with prime rate. When it's increased, that's going to slow down borrowing, which means that less people are going to borrow it because the rates are higher. If this happened during the recession, the housing bubble crisis, to get the economy flowing again, to get people buying houses again, they kept dropping the prime rates, and that trickled down to the interest rates that people were buying for houses. And as a result, lower interest rate, more incentive to go out and get a house because you're paying less interest. The third tool, and the one that's used most often, is known as the open market operations. And this is the buying and selling of government securities, also known as bonds, to alter the supply of money. So this is how it works. Bond purchases, bond sales. If the Federal Reserve sees that the economy is not going very well and they need to increase the money flow into the economy, they use the action of known as a bond purchase. They will go out and they will buy up a whole bunch of bonds that they have already sold to the economy earlier. By doing that, all that bond that's being collected, purchased, and put at the Federal Reserve in New York, that money that used to buy bonds will now be sent out to the economy, creating more money flow. But if we see that inflation is increasing dramatically, well, then what the Federal Reserve does, it forces the individuals who bought the bonds to now buy them back, which means now the money they were using now is used to buy bonds. They're not going to have as much money, which means now they can't borrow it out as much. In return means there's not enough money for more loans. So you can see in open market operations, increase the money flow, the Federal Reserve will buy bonds from the economy. If we need to slow it down, Federal Reserve demands that these bondholders now purchase the bonds back, which is known as a bond sale, to slow things down. So these three tools: required reserve ratio, we looked at prime rates, and open market operations. All three of these tools can be used to slow down the economy, and at the same time it can also be used to grow the economy. So this is the end of Chapter 16, Section 3 notes.